The problems with the James Lange theory led Cannon and Bard to propose their own theory of emotion, known as the Cannon-Bard theory. They argued that we recognize or feel an emotion before we can experience and process physiological responses. The Cannon-Bard theory says we have subjective emotional experiences simultaneously with and independently from physiological arousal. Neither one of them causes the other because they happen along two different pathways in the nervous system. I felt afraid because my brain's emotion processing center was stimulated at the same time that I got a racing heart and rapid breathing because of my autonomic nervous system. There were separate signals that caused my subjective experience of fear and my physiological arousal. It took about 40 more years for another competing theory of emotion to come along, and in the 1960s, we got the Schachter-Singer two-factor theory of emotion. This is where I see a lot of students get confused, because the two-factor theory kind of combines the Cannon-Bard and James Lange theories. Schachter and Singer thought that physiological arousal was essentially the same across all emotions, and that what differentiates fear from anger or sadness from embarrassment is how the individual person interprets and perceives their environment. In this theory, we experience an event that causes general arousal, and then we try to cognitively explain that arousal. If I get all hot and bothered in a protest mob on the quad, I'm likely to explain that as being anger. If I get all hot and bothered at a basketball game, I'm likely to explain that as being excitement. I experienced general physiological arousal when I nearly hit that man on his bicycle, and my cognitive appraisal of my situation led to feeling fear. Like the James Lange theory, the two-factor theory places importance on physiological arousal as part of having a subjective emotional experience or feeling. And like the Cannon-Bard theory, the two-factor theory says that the same arousal patterns can give rise to different emotional experiences. But rather than arousal leading directly to an emotional experience, like in the James Lange theory, or arousal and emotional experiences happening together but independently, like in the Cannon-Bard theory, in the two-factor theory, both the arousal and your assessment of that arousal are needed to create the final emotion. The two-factor theory allows for the subjective understanding of the individual to be the most important part of emotional experiences, because the person's understanding of their environment is how the emotion gets labeled and felt, and is how different people can have different feelings under very similar circumstances. The two-factor theory is also related to a common way that psychologists describe emotions, the circumplex model. This model says that emotions vary along two dimensions called arousal and valence. We've already talked quite a bit about arousal, that feeling of your heart pounding and your palms sweating. Sometimes you have low arousal. You're feeling cool, calm, and collected. Other times you have high arousal. You're feeling like you're going to burst. Valence is whether your emotion is positive or negative. For example, sadness is a negative emotion. Happiness is a positive emotion. So we can describe a given emotional state in terms of how aroused you are and whether you're experiencing that state as positive or negative. The two-factor theory would say that the arousal part comes from your body and the valence part comes from your cognitive appraisal of the situation.